welcome back. I have one bit of unfortunate news to share with all of you, and that is that Michael van Valkenburg's flight to Indianapolis today was canceled. And he tried working with the airline to find any other way he could possibly have gotten here, flying into Louisville, to Cincinnati, to Indianapolis, and just nothing would have possibly gotten here on time. So he sends the following regrets to all of you. And he asked me to read this. I am truly sorry to miss tonight's event. We were having very bad weather in New York City and my flight was canceled at the last minute. There was not any way for me to get there on time tonight. Once that happened, he adds a parenthesis, I even got a haircut yesterday and had my suit pressed. And if you know Michael, that's a fairly big event for him. So. I am equally sorry not to be there and to say in public how much Columbus, and especially Mill Race, means to me. I am very proud of it. Besides cutting my teeth on designing my first public park, the entire town helped me learn to be a better landscaped architect. Anyone would be more than lucky to start out their career working for a guy as kind and caring and smart as Chuck Wilt at Columbus Parks. The Parks Board at the time, were no slouches either. I remember one great question that went sort of like this. Michael, tell us why Central Park is great and what lessons we should learn and apply at Mill Race. While that may seem like Midwestern common sense to you, it's a common sense the world increasingly has less of. Please carry on and have a great time tonight. I'm sad to have missed this. So we appreciate that message from Michael van Valkenburg. And now I'm going to have Chuck Wilt, the retired director of the Parks and Rec Department, join me on stage along with Mark Jones, the current director of Columbus Parks Department. So Chuck, can you describe briefly the context of this project and what your major goals were for it as a client?
Okay. Well, as everybody remembers, Mill Race Park started out as a slum area back in the 60s called Death Valley. And Carl Miskey, the River Rats, for the next 30 years helped Parks keep that park going. We turned it into a riverfront park, and those guys and gals, I know Hutch Shoemaker's here, and Harry McCauley, and maybe there's some other any other river rats here? Okay. That's Don. Don, okay. Don Harvey. Well, they took care of the park. They raised money at their annual breakfasts, and this helped us. Now, the park wasn't too much. There wasn't very many facilities at the park. We had a restroom, and we had the bridge, and that was about it, and some picnic tables. But we tried to utilize the park. We saw the possibilities of the park. We had successes with things like Country in the Park. We built a wooden amphitheater. We thought that would be a neat thing in the 70s. And Mill Race Players was born. And of course, you know Mill Race Players has a lot of programs every summer for the community. Unfortunately, the tornado blew down the wooden amphitheater. We had festival lights. But one thing that we did during that time that really motivated the community about Mill Race Park was we had a birthday party for J. Owen Miller. It was his 75th birthday. And I remember Bob Stewart came to my office, as he usually did, when he wanted me to really get in there and work. And he said, Chuck, we're going to have this birthday party, and that park better look good. And so our staff spent about 3 days getting it ready. And it was really looked nice as we could make it, as you know. It wasn't very easy to make it look real nice. But we had this party, and we had about 3,000 people that showed up. And the buzz in the crowd was, you know, this park's got some real possibilities if we really did something with it. We've got the river, we got the bridge, we got, this could really be something great. Well, a couple years later, Bob Stewart, again, the mayor at that time, appointed the 1992 committee to celebrate the
Quincentennial.
Quincentennial. Thank you. Being retired, I don't do this much anymore. That committee put together a plan to celebrate Columbus, and they wanted to look for a legacy project. So they hired, with the help of Cummins Engine Foundation, we hired Paul Kennan, who at the time was a world-class architect that's done buildings here in Columbus, and he was going to be the lead architect. And he came in and he did squatters meetings down at the Commons, and we got a lot of good ideas about legacy projects. We got the idea about putting ships on the river and then into the Pinta and the Santa Maria, and that was a good one. But we got a lot of comments about the downtown riverfront in Millrace Park, and what are we going to do about that park? And Millrace River Rats and Carl Miskey and those guys had done such a good job of helping us, but the community really saw the potential of that park. And so the committee, which Hutch Shoemaker's here, and he was one of the head people of the committee and the project, got together with the park department, and the major goals that we had for the project was, first of all, we wanted to renovate Millrace into a world-class riverfront park. We wanted it to be, as Bob Stewart would say, everyone's playground. And we wanted it to meet the needs of all age groups and all income levels. And one of the things about the park when we started talking about it was that a lot of people said, well, it's important that everyone, enjoy that park. We also felt that, as part of that goal, that the park should be a magnet for downtown economic development. And we saw the possibilities there, and all the leaders saw the possibilities there. A second thing that was a goal was that we make the park sustainable for generations to come, have high quality and low maintenance landscaping and structures that we put in the park so we could take care of it. So 25 years after we did it, it'd still be a great park. We also, the committee also as a goal had build the Columbus way with collaborative partnerships. And boy, we had a committee, about 50 people, and we had public and private sector leaders in businesses. We had contractors that volunteered to build structures at cost. We had construction labor unions. We had the Federal Job Corps. We had citizen volunteers. And, of course, we had Hutch, who was willing to head up the project, and the committee decided that I would be the on-site coordinator, and I should give up all my responsibilities at Parks Department for the next 2 construction seasons and work with Mike. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself, but so that was going to be another part of it. And fortunately, I hired Wilbur McDonald to help me from Cummins. He was retired, and I'd worked with him there when I'd been at Cummins running Saraland. And then the last was to hire a world-class architect to head up the design. Now, Paul Kennan died during this whole process. he was a great guy. I mean, he and Mike Shirley worked together. And of course, Mike did some projects afterwards, like Foundation for Youth. But he had passed away, and so the world-class architect we were going to bring in was going to actually be the lead architect. And what we wanted was someone who could really communicate, really listen, really identify what our problem was, you know, which our problem was we had a park that was not very functional. And someone that would really come in and give their all for their design, but would also give their all to listen to the people about what they wanted that park to do and what they wanted that park to be for them. And we decided through the Cummins process, after interviewing 6 people, to hire a young architect named Michael Van Valkenburg. And Michael was, I think, 38 years old then, and he fit the bill. He was an up-and-coming architect at the time. We knew if he put his signature on that park, that someday we would be proud to say that Michael Van Valkenburg did our park, because he was a world-famous landscape architect. And we sure hit that one on the button. And so those were our goals and what the park context was.
Thanks. I just want to add one technical challenge.
Okay.
The park floods.
Oh, yes.
Regularly.
Yes.
And so
Definitely floods.
all of the structures, all of the
Right.
the ponds, the maintenance of the water levels had to be engineered to be underwater once a year. So Mark, let me turn to you.
Once a year?
Well, sometimes twice a year.
That's really changed.
Yeah, right. So, you know, how's it been receiving the responsibility for maintaining this park on a floodplain?
Very challenging for sure. It seems like the floods are more than once a year, so that's 3, 4, 5 times a year it seems like. So it's a challenge on the maintenance side of things. I think the staff, the community's done a really good job of maintaining what was designed. But to maintain a flood area, it floods 3, 4, 5 times a year. The sand, the silt over the years has changed the contour of the land, changing the trails lower than the land. So some issues there on maintenance, but overall, I think the design 25 years ago that was put in, it's still very functional. We take a lot of pride in that. So I think, like Chuck was talking about, Michael did a really good job of designing, and the community really takes a lot of ownership in kind of the heart of the city or the park we have.
Yeah, and one thing about Michael is when he says he cares about that park, he really does. He has been in contact with the park department the last 25 years. He's come in, he inspects the park. And one of the things that he said to me that I think is really, really good is he said, you know, Chuck, when I design a park, a lot of times I'll come back a year later and they've changed everything, you know. And that's not good, you know. But he said, you know, with Millrace Park, I can tell that we were all passionate about the design, because I can tell that you're supporting and fighting for the integrity of the design, and we have for the last 25 years. And that was what we committed to do when we hired him, and when we built that park. We wanted it to be what we wanted. We wanted a great design, and we said we would be committed to make sure that it was taken care of. And next year is the 25th anniversary of the renovation of that park. And I would say that it's time, if there's any needs down there, that we do maybe some fundraising next year and celebrate it. And I would urge people to do that.
This is truly the Columbus way. It always ends with a fundraising pitch.
My name is Mark Jones. I'll be off to the side right after.
So Mark, have the needs of the park users evolved over the last 25 years in any significant way that's caused you to rethink any parts of the design?
I think just reading through the history since I was a junior in high school. Sorry, Chuck, when this happened. Going through the articles, the design was to, I believe you said, kind of the everyone's playground, and that's really what it's turned out to be. From the amphitheater being the largest event location we have in the community, thousands of people use our facility, not just for the amphitheater aspect, but the people trails, more and more active. We're getting more and more just recreational activity out there, which is great. Green space, it's a park. So everyone's trying to stay active. We're seeing more and more ultimate frisbee showing up out in the green space, miscellaneous soccer practice here and there. So the park is, again, the way it was designed, it is being utilized that way. And to touch on what Chuck was talking about, we take a lot of pride in making sure we stick to the overall design. There's cheaper materials out there, less expensive to put in for maintenance, but we try to strive to keep that look. Obviously, materials have changed, hard to get certain materials nowadays, so we tweak it here and there, but it is definitely a passion of the Parks Department as well, the community, to try to keep things intact as they were designed.
So, Chuck, if somebody, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Lynne a while ago. If somebody came to you and said, we have this opportunity to work with a riverfront area, we're interested in what you learned in Columbus about the pros and cons of taking this on as a community project, what advice would you give them?
Well, I think first of all, you'd want to get a world-class architect like Michael to be involved. I mean, that's a given. Second of all, I think you'd want to. This project was really a difficult project because basically we didn't want to spend a lot of tax dollars on it because we didn't have it. And so we put this together with the idea that we weren't going to treat it like a public works project. Jim Baker from Arvin, our fundraiser, did a great job of raising about half of the $8 million we were going to have to come up with that we had decided is what it probably would take. But the rest of it was on in-kind labor, and $2 million of that was with the Job Corps. And that was a real challenge, quite frankly. And I think I would recommend that if you're going to do it that way, that you really evaluate just how much work you can get out of those students, because they were trainees, and boy, they were great. There was 200 of those kids from hardcore areas in Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles. I mean, those kids were great, but they were trainees, and it was an adventure every day. I was down there at the park every day, and Hutch would come down with Sherry Stark in her convertible, and they'd with Randy Tucker make sure that I was there. But anyway, the fact is that they couldn't do as much as we thought they could do, and so because they were trainees, they had their instructors. Their instructors answered to people in Washington, D.C., and that was a real circus too at times. But anyway.
Just to explain for a second, for those who aren't from around here, the Job Corps is a federal job training program for inner city youth from major urban areas, headquartered at the time at Camp Atterbury, which is in the northwestern part of our county. As a result, these were inexperienced, untrained kids, but who were subject to all the federal regulations for how their labor was used. So Hutch reminded me today that if there was a 10% forecast of rain, they couldn't work. Because that was in the rule book. So yeah, it was challenging.
Yeah, so that would be something you just have to take in consideration. Also, if you have a world-class architect like Michael, I mean, he is really committed to doing a great design. He's very passionate about his design. He's willing to fight for his design. However, as a client, you need to push back. You need to not feel afraid to do that. And I think you need to set specific goals with him at the top of the top of the project, and just work with him. I think that's what made ours successful. You know, we had, like, with 50 people on the committee, and we have all kinds of opinions, you know, and it was really kind of interesting. So that's what I would say, I guess.
Well, thank you both. We really appreciate your being here this evening.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn to a library project in Hope, Indiana. For those of you not from around here, Hope is a community of only a couple thousand people in the northeastern corner of our county. The Commons Architecture Program has always been available to the county, but it is a community with a distinct identity separate from Columbus. And it's a small town with a really 19th century character that the town square at the heart of it is the identity of. And so the library, building a branch there, was the project which Beth Booth-Poore, who was the librarian at the time, was the client for, and they hired Deborah Berke off of a list in the architecture program. And so they'll represent the original design intent, and Jason Hatton is the current librarian who will represent the user. So I'd like to invite them to come on on stage now, and while they're doing that, I'll show you, well, please welcome them. And just for a little orientation to the slide behind us, this is Deborah's library branch. This is the Harry Weiss branch bank of Irwin Union that was done in the 1950s, the only other modernist building on the town square, which otherwise has 19th century buildings for the most part, but it is pretty much immediately adjacent to the site of the library. So Beth, if you could get us started by telling us about the project and what your goals for it were and the kind of instructions you gave to Deborah.
Of course, most people are familiar with the IMP Library here in Columbus. And we had had a Hope branch since 1922, and it had always been in rented spaces. And the library board wanted to do something for the Hope community to provide library service that was equal to what people were receiving in Columbus. And that meant that we needed to create our own space. And the place where we had been was a double storefront, and for a while it had been adequate. One employee who worked all 40 hours that the library was open at that point. And as the collection grew, and as we added things that we had at the main library, such as videos, this was pre-DVDs, audiobooks on cassette tapes, number of other types of formats that we wanted to have for the folks in Hope as well as in Columbus, we began having a real crunch of space. Some of the children's collection was in a workroom. The workroom also doubled as our programming space, as well as continuing to be the workroom and the lunchroom for that one employee. And then with the advent of computers, and first of all, it was circulation and public catalog, which happened at the end of the 1980s. Then we began to be looking at public computing for the public, and we were having so many issues in that rental space with wiring and infrastructure. So not only were we crushed for space, we were having great difficulties in providing what was at that time modern technology. And so from that, we said, well, we really need to build a lovely building. And in looking around for where that might be, we looked at various places around the community, and folks in Hope were encouraging us to find a place on Town Square. As it turned out, the only part of Town Square that wasn't built out yet was a grassed lot that belonged to Irwin Union Bank. And we weren't sure, I mean, the story around town was, oh, they'll never sell you the property. Well, in making the inquiries, sure, they would sell us the property for a nice branch library, and something, again, that would complement the looks of the bank next to it and also be a wonderful addition to this town square. We really liked that location, staying on the square, and in this case, we ended up on the east side of the square. We'd been on the west side of the square, which is on Route 9. And so it was really dangerous for people to park across the street and walk through there. Even though the speed limit decreases coming through town, many people didn't observe that at all and just went roaring through about 50 or 55 miles per hour. Plus, the west side of the square, just because of reasons of how the town was constructed, had two very steep steps that led up to the branch library. So for any type of handicap access, or just anyone who had any problems with being able to walk or do steps, those people would have to park, go all across the highway, go all the way to the corner, and then walk. And again, if walking is something that's difficult for you, that's the last thing you want to do. So we wanted to be sure that we had a facility that had great parking as close as possible, obviously handicap accessible, and something that was going to be large enough to grow with the community.
So how many architects did you interview, and why did you pick
We
Deborah
interviewed
Berke?
3. I don't know if you know who we interviewed. Okay. The person who we interviewed was William Rahn. Then we interviewed Bumpsoid. And Bumpsoid, you may not be familiar with them as much. Ben Benedict and Carl Pucci were the 2 people from Bumpsoid that we interviewed. And then the following week, we interviewed Deborah. And it's such an interesting process because when Deborah, her CV included primarily residential work at that point. But the board just loved her attitude, they loved her grace, they loved the sleekness and simplicity of her designs, and said, this is the person. And in fact, following Deborah's visit that day, then the board members continued after she had left to have a meeting and said, well, we need to go ahead and decide who it's going to be. And Steve Succo, who was the director at that time, said, okay, well, all the other interview information is in my office, I'll go get it. By the time he came back downstairs to our conference room, the board members had already decided that they wanted to hire Deborah. So it was the shortest decision-making in the world. And it was unanimous that Deborah should be our choice. And so we let her know immediately. I mean, I can't remember the exact timing, but possibly by the time she got back to New York City, we'd already let her know that she was our choice. And so again, it was a very easy choice, and for us, the perfect choice.
So Deborah, what were the most interesting design challenges as you looked at this project? Yep.
Is this working? Yep. There were a couple of interesting challenges about doing the building. One was how to respect the square. The square is actually fantastic and quite, I'm going to say quite authentic, as though it is, it's real. So one wanted to be part of it and blend in enough to be a good citizen, but also note through this building that this was an important civic structure, a library where everybody in the community, from the youngest to the oldest, were going to use it, and use it not only for books and videos and computer access and reading to children or getting the newspaper in the middle of the day, or all the various kinds of functions that people use public libraries for. So it functioned, in my understanding of talking to Beth and the other people I was working with, almost as a community center without the name community center, because it met so many purposes. So what did it look like on this square, and how did it do that next to this building, which is a building that I think is absolutely beautiful, but it's diminutive. I mean, I think I could stand there and touch the top brick on that thing. And so how to get the right scale for the library and be an appropriate neighbor to the Harry Weiss Bank, and we were, I guess, 40 years after the Harry Weiss Bank, the library went in. Those were the biggest design questions.
So what kind of strategies did you develop to rise to those challenges?
Well, brick for sure. Brick was a decision from the get-go, both to refer back to the Pay building, to give the solidity that a civic building required, to pay homage to the Weiss building, and because The buildings around the square vary pretty significantly, but the more robust ones are not only made out of brick, but have brick detailing. So it wasn't just laid up brick, but you would find some patterning, not just in your lintels and sills, but also as a cornice line or as a little detail at the bottom. So people had taken care with the brickwork. I liked that. You know, I have a penchant for the everyday, and I like going around and seeing details that are sometimes created by architects and sometimes created by non-architects who are just very proud of what they're making. And so step one was choosing a material, and then kind of respecting the rhythm and form that that material seemed to bring to this place.
So Jason is someone not involved in the original design project. Are there ways in which this building exceeds your expectations, and are there things that you might have done differently if it were your project today?
Well, it's, you know, as far as exceeding expectations, I mean, and I talked to the staff a little bit about it, who spend most of their time out there. I get to spend most of my time here in Columbus at the main branch, and we have Dave Miller, I think, our branch manager out there in the audience, who spends a lot of time out there. But, and I think Jim Bickel said this, that, you know, really it's kind of a timeless design, as he referred to, you know, the hospital environment. I think that's very appropriate for this as well. That, and, you know, it's not a large space, right? It's not a large building. It's not, yeah, right, absolutely. But it feels so open.
6,000 square feet.
Absolutely. But it feels open and spacious, and, you know, it draws you in right from the get-go. And I think one of the challenges with libraries, right, is you have so much stuff to put in there, right? You have bookcases full of books and all those sorts of pieces. And I think one of the things is that it sets those pieces back, right, to be able to, again, bring you that feeling and bring that feeling of openness, and that community center feel, I think, is very appropriate and very, very telling about that. And so, you know, I think in all of those fashions, again, just light, open, airy, just very welcoming as far as exceeding expectations.
And
I'm going to say there was one aspect of the design that the three of us, along with the board members, participated in. The initial design, and I don't know what pictures we have to show today, the initial design in 1995 included a flat roof. And those of you who are familiar with the problems that have had at the main library with a flat roof, the board said, no way, no way, no way. And so Will met with Deborah and with Steve Suko and myself in the Red Room one day, and we looked at designs, and Deborah had created another design that had a very nice extension that had windows facing the north and then a sharp slope, to which Will replied, I'm afraid that looks like a chicken coop. Let's not do that.
This is a true story.
And so then Will and Deborah met in New York the following month, and Deborah came up with a curve, basically sort of an arc shape to it, which is the shape that everybody loved. We went with it, and it has worked out very well, and we've not had that first leak.
It's a true story. It's also, Beth is telling it as though it was the warmest, most gentle experience any architect could have ever had. Now, Beth is a lovely woman, but Will, who is my friend now, what was intimidating in his architectural criticism. And I really, when he came to the office in New York, it was definitely a tail between one's leg kind of experience for the architect, for me, or that's how I felt. But you were right, made the design better, the space inside is better, but it was a horrible few weeks of...
you're welcome. So just to balance that story, I had not met Deborah before, other than the time in the Red Room at the library either, and my role was because it was the neighbor to Irwin Union Bank. And so I wasn't coming at it through the Commons Architecture Program, which I think is important for folks to understand, but as a neighbor on the Hopetown Square. From my point of view, actually, Deborah listened well. I'm sorry it was an intimidating experience. I probably could have done it better, but we, a couple of years later, went to build a new branch bank here in Columbus. And I'd been so impressed with the job she'd done and the responsiveness and the thoughtfulness with which she'd dealt with the challenges to the design that we hired her to do what we call the Creekview branch. My favorite story about that, though, is when we met first about hope, I said to Deborah, context is everything here. This is the heart of a little community, and if you screw it up, it's going to be really bad. So,
And that wasn't intimidating at all.
No. Meant in the friendliest possible way. And, I just sort of, I think I probably did hammer context a little too much. When I hired her for the Creekview branch, I explicitly said, your job is to improve the context, because it was a drive-in hot dog stand and a Kohl's
Custard.
And a custard stand, and it was just strip mall America out there. And so, and you did, by the way, you improved the context out there. So.
Thank you.
I was gonna say, during the process too, another thing that was very interesting, and as I was telling Deborah earlier, I congratulate her for her forbearance. This project took 4 years. And we began in 1994. She was hired in late October. We signed the contract in November. There were numerous issues with the site. It began by determining that 5.5 feet of another building was on the land that we were going to purchase from Urban Union Bank. And so Urban Union Bank was willing to replat, and we took 5.6 feet from their property to the north. There was an electric line that ran through underneath that we didn't know was there. There was a sewer that needed to be moved, and that took 1.5 years. That's another story for another night. We found the slab of a basement of a structure no one had remembered had been on the site. Just numerous things, and of course, a fuel tank, which was sitting behind the bank, which hadn't been used for years, but part of it was on the property that would still be the bank, and part of it was on the property that would be the library. So that was an issue that needed to be dealt with too, not only for the property lines, but also the EPA considerations of it. So in November of '95, a year after we had started, we basically had to go on hiatus. And Deborah said, and we had to actually even purchase the land from the bank yet, because we needed to make sure that we could take care of these issues of what was underneath the land. And so finally, in December of '95, this is a year and a few months after Deborah was hired, we actually purchased the land, and then she could begin working on documents for the construction. But again, we did not have the meeting with potential bidders or select Rep and Mont as our builder until the summer of 1997. So we were coming up on almost 3 years since Deborah had been hired. And in fact, Cummins Engine Foundation, Adele Vincent, contacted us at one point and said, we're going to give you an additional stipend. This was when we were stuck in hiatus. And she said, but that's all the money you're going to get. And as it turned out, that funding did run out, and the library was able to then finish the architect's fee as well as all of the other building fees. But we finally had our opening. We had our dedication in June of 1998. And we weren't quite finished with all the moving in, and so the library actually opened then 2 weeks later in July. But again, we went almost 4 full years from the time of the inception of the project to the finishing. So again, thank you for sticking with us.
So, Jason, the typical library today doesn't bear that much resemblance to a library in 1995. Technology has changed, the nature of the retrieval of information and the services needed. How has the building done adopting to the new technical requirements of being a community center and a library?
Really, again, surprisingly well. I mean, I think, you know, we were right on the forefront of all that wiring, and so I think if we would have been, really, in some ways, if we would have completed the project on time, I think we might have missed some of those technological innovations, right? So, you know, wiring and all those things were kind of planned, at least as part of it, so we've been able to move that.
Yeah, there's an entire grid underneath the main floor, which
right.
works beautifully. I wish we had that at the main library.
Yep, absolutely. But again, from its openness and from its, being able to shift places where we need to, it really adapts very well to the space. I mean, I'll say that, one of the things, if we were doing it today, that I might do a little bit differently is that, one of the things we don't have is we don't have a kind of a dedicated programming space, right? We have lots of great programs at the main library with lots of speakers and lots of presenters, and so we don't have quite that space at the Hope Library that I would love to be able to do at some point in time, to be able to provide those things.
I have a card.
Perfect. Excellent. It's great.
An addition.
Well, actually, the lot is a slope itself, and so it's built into the back of the hill, so there really is room.
I knew I loved you.
So Deborah, as you got this experience moving beyond residential architecture into more institutional stuff, was your early experience in Columbus, did any of what you learned here carry over into your subsequent work?
I think the most directly relevant experience to the Hope Library in particular actually came fairly recently when we did a hotel in Bentonville, Arkansas. Bentonville, Arkansas has a slightly different history than Columbus and Hope, although interestingly enough, the leading family in Bentonville, Arkansas is beginning a program not unlike the Cummins Foundation program, and I think they've been in touch with you for guidance. They've certainly contacted me.
Well, in fact, the chair of the committee advising them on the putting together the lists is here tonight.
Yay, welcome. It's fantastic. It's really fantastic. Anyway, what I was going to say about coming to Bentonville is that Bentonville has a square, and I got there and thought, okay, I know how to do this. I know what the building needs to do on a square to be both part of it and distinct from it, and to bring it forward in a way, not only in terms of the style of the architecture and contribute to moving the eras forward, but in this instance in Bentonville, to use the building as a way to connect the square to the Crystal Bridges Museum, which is a convoluted drive from the square, but actually a beautiful walk through a park that has sculpture in it and is the perfect setup for getting there. It's nicer to walk there. So the experience here played out 12, 14 years later there in another town with a square that was looking to not to revitalize or bring some vibrancy and new life to its square. So I don't know where you are, Mr. Arkansas or Mrs. Arkansas out there, but I hope the square is continuing to thrive in Bentonville. But that was really the best lesson, town square. I'm from Queens, there are no town squares, but they're actually beautiful civic spaces, and introducing the right kinds of programs and the right attitude about architecture can make them function better.
So you recently became Dean of the Yale School of Architecture, and yes, there is a New Haven-Columbus connection. We can go into that at some other point. Has anything about your experience here informed your thinking about architectural education?
I know you want the answer to be, of course.
No, the answer can be no.
In part, although I will say as an educator and as an architectural educator, I think almost every experience in every day of one's life, if you are observant about the built environment, contributes to thoughts on being an educator. This experience in particular, because it was a town so different from my own personal history, those habits of observing, looking, drawing, talking, listening, those are the, I guess, the architectural skills I would like all of our students, and actually all architecture students, to have as they go out in the world and become architects, which is to look, take note, listen carefully. Don't lose your own voice, but don't remember that you're also in the service of the mission of others.
So, Beth, if you got this call that I've been posing to each of the then clients here in our community, of someone seeking advice. In this case, let's say they just hired Deborah Berke. Is there a particular set of advice on how to get the best out of her firm and her?
Well, again, just work with her. In so many cases, as I said, I was assistant director at the time, and the library director, Steve Succo, basically dealt with some of these issues of the lot itself and had to be kind of the bad guy on this. And I got the pleasure of being able to work on the building details with Deborah. And always, if I needed to talk with her, she was right there on the phone. I didn't talk to an assistant. I didn't have to go through 10 or 12 people to reach her. We communicated quite often. In those days, this was pre-email. We also had letters back and forth, but primarily by phone. And again, as I said, through this whole 4-year-long process, she was nothing but helpful to us as we had to persevere to get this project finished. So again, I would just say she's a dream to work with. She values the client's opinion. She listens to what the client has to say. And I'm sure that some of you who've worked with other architects have not had that experience. We were very blessed to have an architect who just fit in so well with our project.
Thank you.
So, Deborah, if I came to you and said, I've never been a client before, what, and you may have some specific advice for me, given our interactions at the beginning. What would you say would make for a really good client?
I think this is going to be a funny place for an architect to start, and I can see Bob's eyes rolling without even knowing where he's seated in the auditorium. But have a budget. Doesn't have to be a big one, but know what it is. Listen to your architect as you develop your program. So it's good to know what you want and what you need, but it's also good to be open to the ideas of others. Hang on to knowing what you need, but let your architect show you their ideas, how they think, lend support, but architects have visions. They can see things in 3 dimensions. They can understand how the light comes in a room, or how a breeze goes through a house, or what a facade looks like on a street. That really is what we know how to do. Other people can read music or play world champion tennis. You know, people have different skills. Architects really do know how to make form and space, and I think a good client has the sense to know when to shape what their architect is doing and when to let the architect go with their ideas.
Well, thank you. This has, I think, been a good illustration all of these conversations have about that idea of the solving of a specific problem, an authentic expression of the architect, a way of expressing the client and their identity without which the client probably couldn't have done on their own. So it's that triple achievement that we were trying to illustrate today. So thank you. That's a great note to end on. Please join me in thanking our panelists.